Welcome to State Fleet Utilization Buying an Electric Vehicle Training. Charge me up and let's get started. The main sections we are going to talk about today are listed to the right. So you've been tasked with purchasing an electric vehicle, also known as an EV. You may be wondering why there is such a push to purchase electric vehicles here in Colorado. It is one of the governor's greening initiatives to help us reduce our carbon footprint. And as the state fleet management, we are here to help you and your agency move forward with that plan. Almost everyone has probably heard the reference of climate change and has a basic understanding how greenhouse gases play a significant role. In order to reduce that impact, it is important for us to eliminate, or at the very least reduce, the greenhouse gases emitted into our environment and atmosphere, thereby reducing our carbon footprint. How do we reduce our carbon footprint, you ask? That is a great question. A number of industries use equipment, technology, or other products that contribute to the emission of greenhouse gases. And you guessed it, transportation is one of those industries. Would you be surprised if I told you that each gallon of gasoline produces 20 pounds of carbon dioxide? Let me explain. Gasoline consists of approximately 87% carbon and 13% hydrogen. A gallon of gas weighs approximately 6.5 pounds. Therefore, the carbon in each gallon of gas weighs approximately 5.5 pounds. Like most things in life, however, it is not quite that simple. So let's talk about burning gasoline. When gasoline burns, the carbon and the hydrogen separate. The hydrogen combines with oxygen to form water, or H2O, and the carbon combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, or CO2, which happens to be a greenhouse gas. So let's take it a step further and talk about carbon dioxide. A carbon atom has an atomic weight of 12, and an oxygen atom has a weight of 16. So the atomic weight of a single module of CO2 is 44, 12 from carbon and 32 from oxygen. The atomic weight of CO2 is 3.7 times more than the carbon atom alone, 44 divided by 12. To calculate the amount of CO2 produced from a gallon of gasoline, we take the weight of the carbon in the gasoline, 5.5, and multiply it by 3.7, which equals 20.35. Round the total, and you will discover that each gallon of gasoline produces 20 pounds of carbon dioxide. To help reduce the state's carbon footprint, Colorado has adopted the Zero Emissions Vehicle Program, which requires increasing sales and use of zero-emission vehicles over the next decade. To further support this initiative, Governor Polis has signed Executive Order D 2022016, which orders the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from state vehicles by 15% by the end of fiscal year 2024 and 25. Now that you understand why there is such a push to purchase electric vehicles, where do you begin? So let's start with data collection. Understanding utilization, drive patterns, and dwell time is the foundation to your electrification options. These can all be monitored by telematics in a vehicle. Taking information from what you have learned with telematics and having your operations teams review it will provide you with a solid picture as to what you need in an EV and how much charging infrastructure and where it will need to be deployed. All of this information will assist you when selecting the right electric vehicle. So you may be wondering, what is telematics? Well, telematics is a method of monitoring an asset, including a car, a truck, heavy equipment. These components include a GPS receiver, an engine interface, an input-output interface, or an expander port, a SIM card, an accelerometer, or maybe even a buzzer. The second point of data collection revolves around reaching out to your operations. Reviewing the information gathered by telematics will enable you to hold the informed discussions around what is feasible with the EV technology available today, given the miles traveled routinely, the available time to charge, which involves your dwell time or your time parked, and the charging stations required. The broad understanding of the overall operational needs of the fleet will provide you with education that can be passed on to everyone that has a question. The more you invest in the pre-work, the more successful the next phases of the process will be. Where can I get telematics, you ask? If you are interested in telematics, contact a member of your fleet team and ask them if there are plans to deploy telematics devices for your agency's vehicles. Telematics are currently being installed throughout the state's fleet, and your deployment could be right around the corner. So now we are going to talk about charging infrastructure. A great place to start is to identify currently installed charging stations, as well as any planned implementation. Collect as much information as you can about the existing charging infrastructure, including the charger type, the location, days and times of availability, and the anticipated vehicle load of each station. For planned implementations, include the scheduled installation date and equipment availability date as well. All this information will assist you when selecting an EV. If your agency does not have charging stations or a plan in place to implement charging stations, now is the time to connect with your executive leadership to work towards that goal. Next, we will discuss some key things to consider when you work through the planning process with your leadership. As we do so, keep in mind that your plans should not be limited to today's needs. It is important to think about the equipment your agency will need in the next several years and plan ahead. One of the first things to consider is the type of charging station your agency will require. There are 3 levels of charging stations currently available: Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3. It is important to have an understanding of each level of station. A Level 1 charging station is typically used for home charging as it requires a 3-pronged standard residential 120-volt outlet. This charger is most suitable for low and medium range plug-in hybrids, but may be suitable for an all-electric battery electric vehicle if the vehicle has low daily driving usage. A Level 1 charger adds approximately 5 miles of usage per hour of charging and requires the use of a universal EV plug. That's an SAE J1772 to connect to the car, with the exception of Teslas, which require an adapter. Now let's move on to the Level 2 charging station. It can be used for residential charging and is also the most common type of public charger. This level of charger typically requires a charging unit on a 240-volt outlet, such as one used to power an electric clothes dryer. The 240-volt outlet charges in about half the time it takes to charge with a Level 1 charger. A Level 2 charger adds approximately 20 to 80 miles of usage per hour of charging, depending on amps. Public Level 2 chargers also use a universal EV plug, also known as SAE J1772, that fits all current vehicles, as we mentioned before, with the exception of Teslas, which require an adapter. Finally, there is the Level 3 charging station, also known as a DC fast charging or a DCFC station. The DCFC station is the fastest charging station currently available and is typically for commercial use. A Level 3 charger adds approximately 60 to 100 miles of usage per hour of charging, again, depending on amps. All Level 3 DCFC chargers offer one of 3 unique plug types: CHAdeMO for Nissan and Mitsubishi, and SAE CCS, US and European automakers, and Tesla. It is important to understand that charging at a DCFC station is only effective if your battery state of charge is below 80%, because once the battery reaches that threshold, charging will slow significantly. Another thing to note is that most plug-in hybrid vehicles are incompatible with Level 3 DCFC stations. These vehicle charging needs will be routinely met by Level 1, Level 2 charging. Now that you have an understanding of the different types of charging stations available, you need to determine how many stations your agency will require. How do you determine the appropriate number of charging stations your agency will need? Currently, the state is using a 1-to-1 ratio for EVs. If your agency's plan is to purchase one PHEV or EV, you need a charging station for each. It's an easy calculation. If you have 6 vehicles, you will need to purchase 6 charging stations, and so on. If, however, your agency will not purchase a charging station for each PHEV or EV, then it is important to understand the operational use and dwell time of each vehicle that will need to be charged. Remember, fueling time or charge time is the major change from petroleum to EVs. Now it might be worthwhile to work through some examples. In our first example, Agency A is considering purchasing 2 charging stations and 5 EVs. All of Agency A's 5 EVs are used to transport patients every weekday, and each vehicle leaves the facility at the beginning of the workday and does not return until the end of the workday. In this scenario, 2 charging stations will not be sufficient since each vehicle will need to charge nightly to prepare for the following day's use, and only 2 of the 5 vehicles will be able to charge at the end of the day. Even if there were somebody on site after hours to swap the vehicles, there would likely not be enough time for each vehicle to receive a full charge before its next trip. Now let's go to Agency B. Agency B is also considering purchasing 2 charging stations and 5 EVs. 2 of Agency B's 5 EVs are used 2 days of the week for site visits, 2 are used between 2 and 3 days of the week to perform agency audits, and the last EV is only used occasionally for district meetings, at the most twice a month. In this scenario, it may be possible that 2 charging stations will be sufficient, simply by realigning the days that each vehicle is in use. For instance, if the 2 vehicles used for site visits consistently use their vehicles on Mondays and Thursdays, and the 2 vehicles used for audits consistently use their vehicles on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, each vehicle will have adequate time for charging overnight in between trips. This information should be reviewed as part of your telematics data. As for the 5th vehicle, since the vehicle is used on such a limited basis, an evaluation to determine if the vehicle is required to perform the job is warranted, since using an alternative vehicle such as a rental car for these limited district meetings may be more cost-effective than keeping the vehicle. Another option is to have the audit team schedule their reduced workload weeks on the same weeks as the district meetings, thereby freeing up either one of their vehicles or a charging station to charge the 5th EV to take to the district meeting, if in fact the 5th EV remains in the fleet. Your agency's fleet is likely much larger than 5 vehicles. A review of each vehicle's use with the telematics data case will be a necessity in determining how many charging stations are needed at each of your agency's locations. Performing this research will also help you identify if the size of your fleet should be adjusted to meet your agency's requirements and opportunities, where changes in use can also maximize each vehicle's utilization. Now let's talk about prime location. Once you have identified the type and number of chargers needed, you will need to find the right location or locations to have them installed. It will be valuable to first identify available lots or garages that may work. Then answer the following questions along with the help of your leadership to identify prime locations. Is there enough room to install the number of stations needed? Is the area secured? Is this a public area? And if so, will public charging be allowed? Is the location state-owned or leased? Who needs to be part of this conversation? Is the location easily accessible for employees? Are utility reviews required for installation of EV SE equipment? Are the installation costs at this site within our budget? Are there any traffic or weather-related safety concerns? Now that you have done the prep work, you can begin the process of selecting an electric vehicle. So let's begin with range. One of the most common things people need to understand before purchasing an electric vehicle is the range that is needed. When we talk about the range of an EV, we are referring to the distance the EV can travel before the battery needs to be recharged. Using either a daily mileage log or data from a telematics device, if one is installed, are great ways to determine the average daily mileage of the vehicle that will be replaced, as well as the number of days in which the vehicle exceeded the range limits of a selected EV. If a vehicle occasionally exceeds the range limit of an EV, that does not mean that the EV should not be considered. Actually, it is quite the opposite. If your existing vehicle only occasionally exceeds the range threshold, your agency should plan to purchase an EV and use an alternative vehicle for those occasional trips. So let's talk about operational use. A vehicle's operational use and functional needs must be identified before ordering an EV, not only to ensure that the selected EV is compatible, but also to understand any impact to the range of the vehicle. Some of the things to be aware of and to research before you select and purchase an EV include: 1 is upfit. Be sure that the selected EV is compatible with all needed upfit or accessories such as light kits, sirens, cages, or other aftermarket items to be installed anywhere on or in the vehicle. 2 is cargo space. Find out what the driver is hauling and make sure the EV has adequate cargo space to meet the requirements of the position. 3 is vehicle use. A van carrying passengers is typically driven much differently than a police car involved in a high-speed chase. So become aware of how the vehicle will be used and make sure the EV is compatible. And the fourth thing to think about is weight. The weight capacity of a vehicle goes hand in hand with its use. A van full of people will likely weigh more than a van with boxes of foam cups. Either way, it is important to become informed of any weight limits that the selected EV may have and how the average weight of the vehicle during normal use may impact the range of the vehicle. There are a few other factors to consider on top of the ones we just mentioned. Other factors that can impact the range of a vehicle is the terrain and weather in which the vehicle is primarily driven. Vehicles driven primarily on winding, climbing, mountain, or dirt roads will likely experience less of a range than vehicles driven primarily on flat city or country roads. And of course, high or low temperatures, along with the need to use either the heater or the air conditioner, can impact a vehicle's range as well. Most importantly, remember to do your research before you select and purchase an EV. It is important to review before ordering. Now that you have an understanding of the charging stations available to your agency and you've selected the EVs that will meet your agency's needs, a final review is suggested before ordering the vehicles. By utilizing all of the research you performed related to each vehicle's use, you can create a charging schedule or calendar, or simply use telematics data gathered to determine if each vehicle will have adequate time to charge between trips. First, let's talk about current availability. If you do not have a charger for every electric vehicle, remember to identify opportunities for shared charging. Vehicles leaving or returning midday can take advantage of available charging stations while the rest of the fleet is out around town. This will take significantly more effort to manage and should be a secondary consideration for fleets that require a high state of readiness. Second is location. Be sure to take into account the vehicle's primary location when creating a charging schedule. If you are waiting for new EVSE equipment to be implemented, consider using a nearby public charging station. It is important to understand, however, that some stations charge additional fees above the kWh rate, such as a flat parking rate. Some stations allow a limited window of time for charging and will charge prime rates or fees if a vehicle is left in the space beyond the allowed charging time. Be sure to educate employees about these additional fees so that they can plan to move a charging vehicle before the time limit has been reached. Thinking back to the types of charging stations available, be sure that the nearby charging station has a connector that is compatible with the EV, and remember that most plug-in hybrid vehicles are incompatible with Level 3 DCFC stations. Third, we have dwell and charging time. Remember that a vehicle's dwell and charging time are important. If a vehicle needs a full charge for each day of use, then it will take longer to charge the vehicle, so be sure that the vehicle is returned to the lot early enough in the day or evening and that it will be able to charge for an adequate length of time in preparation for the next day's use. And the last thing to think about before ordering is traveling and road trips. Just because your agency has purchased EVs, that does not mean that road trips are impossible. It does mean, however, that research is key before embarking on a road trip in an EV. The range of the vehicle is the first thing to identify, and mapping your trip is essential. Utilizing your mapped plans, you will need to research available charging stations along your journey and at each of your destinations. Of course, you will also need to make sure that the type of charging stations available are appropriate for the vehicle and that you will have adequate time at each location to charge the vehicle. Verify that the WEX credit card and the ChargePoint card are in the vehicle's glove box before you hit the road, as you will likely need to pay to charge the vehicle. And finally, if an EV is simply not a good option for your planned road trip, the use of a rental car may be a good option for this unique task. Great job! Your detailed work has paid off. You've implemented EVSE. Now what? We will all reap the rewards of reducing our carbon footprint. Let's help you look down the road and see what other items we can prepare you for. It may or may not be your responsibility to maintain the EVSE equipment your agency has installed, but it is a good idea for you to have an understanding of EVSE equipment. Now let's talk fueling costs. One aspect of owning EVSE equipment is fueling costs incurred for the charging events and how the rates may vary. The power company, Xcel Energy for most Denver metro area locations, typically charges a standard rate per kilowatt hour based on the current demand and the time of the charging event. Charging events that occur during a prime time, also known as time of use, will incur a higher rate. As previously discussed, some public charging stations also charge for the parking spot and add additional fees for vehicles exceeding their allotted charging time. If you intend to allow public charging at any of your charging stations, you will need to determine the rates and fees you wish to impose for public vehicles. Equally important is the education of employees on the use of charging stations, whether agency-owned or public, to keep the cost of charging your vehicles under control. And finally, maintenance. Just like any other mechanical or technical equipment, the EVSE equipment needs to have regular maintenance performed. Be sure to check with the manufacturer to identify the specific maintenance requirements and the recommended frequency. Eventually, all of this brand new EVSE equipment will need to be replaced. It is wise to plan ahead and incorporate the cost of the replacement equipment into the rate structure of your charging stations or operational planning. Way to go! You're now prepared to purchase an EV. Thank you for taking the time to review this video. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how to prepare for and select an appropriate electric vehicle for your agency's fleet. For questions, feel free to reach out to the State Fleet Management FAST Team, DPA_SFM training_support at state.co.us or 303-866-5222.